Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Turkey and Azerbaijan have a very long history of relations, long enough to test whether a partnership is based on rhetoric or on results. Official statements lean heavily on the familiar phrase, one nation, two states, a slogan that has outlived several regional crises, wars, pipeline disputes, and shifting global alignments. But slogans are easy. What matters is how they translate into power, leverage, and strategic outcomes. Because this relationship is no longer just about shared history or cultural affinity. It is instead about energy corridors, military interoperability, post-war reconstruction, and shaping the balance of power in the South Caucasus. And as the region enters a more volatile phase, the Turkey-Azerbaijan partnership tells us less about brotherhood and more about how modern alliances are built, tested, and defended. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
In a bid to diversify its energy sourcing, the Turkish government is working to strike long-term deals with Azerbaijan to increase energy cooperation. In December last year, the two countries signed the 12th Joint Economic Commission Protocol, including a 110-point cooperation plan to cover, among others, energy, trade, and investments. Later that same month, Turkey announced that it is also ready to work with Azerbaijan on renewable energy investments. Further strengthening cooperation, on January 4th, Baku and Ankara signed a 15-year gas contract to supply Turkey with gas from the Absheron gas field, located approximately 100 kilometers off the shore of Azerbaijan. The agreement, set to begin in 2029, will set the importation of 33 billion cubic meters of natural gas throughout the duration of the contract. While energy ties continue to deepen, Azerbaijan has already been a major supplier of natural gas for several years. In 2024, Azeri gas exports to Turkey reached roughly 11.5 billion cubic meters, up 12% from 2023. Baku also operates the Southern Gas Corridor, a set of pipelines that transport gas from the Caspian Sea upwards to Turkey. Turkey has long supported Azerbaijan as a close political ally, with Ankara firmly standing with Baku, including over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region. As it seeks to diversify its energy sourcing, Turkey's warm political relations with Baku reflect not just a spirit of fraternity, but also economic pragmatism.
And now let's focus on the East-splaining portion of our show. While Turkey has treated Azerbaijan as a close energy partner, Ankara has historically imported significant amounts of fuel from Russia. Yet, despite pushing for energy diversification, Turkey has prolonged its gas import agreements with the Kremlin. As always, here is a closer look.
Last year in December, Ankara extended its expiring agreements for the import of Russian gas by another year. The deal promises Turkey a total of 22 billion cubic meters of gas from the Russian company Gazprom. Turkey represents Russia's last significant natural gas market in Europe, as multiple years of sanctions related to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine have limited Moscow's ability to do business with its neighboring continent. Despite this, Turkey's energy ministry reported that the contracts to import Russian gas only represent a short-term policy. This comes as the Turkish state gas importer, BOTAŞ, has signed separate agreements to procure U.S. liquefied natural gas as well as infrastructure-related investments. According to the agreement from last December, Turkey plans to purchase 1,500 LNG cargoes from the United States over the next 15 years. Ankara is also reportedly in talks with Iran and Turkmenistan to increase gas imports. While Turkey continues to cooperate with Russia, analysts say that their partnership is likely to diminish in due time. Without Turkish imports, Russian gas now risks losing its last major European client.
And now, as always, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Diplomatic relations between Turkey and Azerbaijan were formalized in January 1992, but the political logic behind them was set much earlier. When Azerbaijan emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ankara moved quickly to recognize its independence, not only out of cultural affinity, but strategic foresight. A newly independent Azerbaijan sat at the crossroads of energy routes, post-Soviet instability, and unresolved territorial conflicts. Ignoring that would have been geopolitical malpractice. Under Heydar Aliyev, it became an organizing principle. Under Ilham Aliyev, it evolved into something closer to an alliance, with concrete institutions, joint planning, and long-term coordination. Energy remains the backbone of that alliance. Projects like the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline and TANAP mentioned earlier in the show were not merely commercial ventures. They were geopolitical statements. They bypassed Russia, reduced dependency on traditional transit routes, and tied Azerbaijan's export strategy directly to Ankara's role as an energy hub. Today, Azerbaijani gas flowing through Turkey reaches multiple European markets, embedding both countries into Europe's energy security architecture, whether Brussels always admits it or not. Transport infrastructure reinforces the same logic. The Baku-Tbilisi Kars Railway physically anchors the South Caucasus to Turkey, while the proposed Zangezur corridor would, if realized, redraw regional collectivity altogether. For Ankara and Baku, this is about strategic depth and uninterrupted access. For Russia and Iran, it is a challenge to their traditional influence over regional transit routes. This is not neutral infrastructure. It is political geography made concrete. Economic ties reflect the same asymmetry of seriousness. Azerbaijan is Turkey's largest foreign investor, with more than $20 billion committed, while Turkish companies dominate non-oil sectors in Azerbaijan. Thousands of firms operate on both sides, and bilateral trade has more than tripled in under a decade. Military cooperation is where the relationship shifts from partnership to alliance. Since the early 1990s, Turkey and Azerbaijan have signed over 100 defense agreements. Joint exercises, NATO standard training, and deep integration of command structures have turned Azerbaijan's armed forces into one of the most capable militaries in the post-Soviet space. Turkish defense industry products, including drones, are now central to Azerbaijan's military doctrine, not symbolic add-ons. At the leadership level, the Erdogan-Aliyev relationship provides continuity. Frequent high-level visits, coordinated messaging, and parallel diplomatic initiatives ensure that Ankara and Baku rarely surprise each other. In a volatile region, predictability among allies is a strategic asset. After 34 years of post-Soviet bilateral relations, Turkey-Azerbaijan relations are no longer defined by history alone. One nation, two states endures not because it sounds good, but because it has been operationalized. And in geopolitics, that is the difference between a slogan and a real alliance. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Adam Michalski, Research Fellow at the Department for Turkey, Caucasus and Central Asia of the Center for Eastern Studies. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Turkey and Azerbaijan, natural allies, right? But their cooperation, especially in the field of infrastructure, apparently is rubbing a few countries the wrong way. Can you tell us more about why the project involving the construction of the railway to the Nakhchivan region is actually controversial for some countries in the region and beyond?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the Zangezur corridor or this whole project concerning the Trump proposal of a route connecting Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan, well, obviously, this type of railway link will be running through the territory of Armenia, which has been a topic of discussion for decades. After the Karabakh War in 2020, both Armenia and Azerbaijan agreed that they would discuss the development of such a corridor and such a connection. But obviously, these discussions have been highly controversial because with regards to the topic of who controls that road, how is it administered, those were the topics that for Armenia were always a very hard topic to talk with the victorious Azerbaijan when it came to connecting the Nakhchivan province with the mainland of Azerbaijan. And so what happened last year was Donald Trump stepped in with his Trump corridor proposal, which essentially transfers the control of that corridor running through Armenia and linking Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan to a U.S. company for 100 years, which would administer it and essentially remove that bottleneck of who controls what. And that way, perhaps these talks could go on forward, because then the other alternative is the traditional way that has been the support line for Nakhchivan, which is, of course, the railway and the road connection that it has with Turkey. But it means that, you know, if that's the only connection that it has to rely on a longer route, which crosses through Turkey, Georgia, all the way to Azerbaijan, which has always been, for the last couple of decades, a big problem. And so hence there's a huge pressure on Armenia to try to reconsider this trade route, this railway connection going through its territory. And obviously, you know, if you look at also other players from the region like Russia, you know, solving these type of problems for them means that they cannot necessarily play these sides each other off. So actually, you know, if a conclusion to this infrastructure debate would be over, then this is one topic less that Russia can use to intervene and play one side against the other.
So obviously, you know, that's a part of the story, right? You know, the TRIP project, the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, that's one thing. But apparently there is also controversy regarding another section of this whole route, namely the railway leading from Turkey towards the exclave of Nakhchivan. And this, even though, you know, it's on the surface of it, it should be less controversial because, like, you know, it doesn't involve the question of, you know, the tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, at least not to the same extent. This is also something that Russia, Iran, and other countries are taking exception to. So can you perhaps delve into that as well? Because it shows some interesting dynamics taking place.
I mean, definitely Turkey has been expanding its connection with Nakhchivan over the last couple of years. That is the result of the fact that Turkey and Azeri relations after the Karabakh War in 2020 have suddenly, you know, turned almost into a bromance. And, you know, previously they weren't really that good. But Turkey does realize that, you know, it can play a fundamental role in, you know, connecting Nakhchivan to the rest of the world. This is obviously forcing, you know, countries like perhaps Iran to reconsider that perhaps some of the products maybe that were going through its territory would be now going through Turkey's territory because it has a better connection and easier connection. So it's definitely, you know, reshaping the kind of balance in the Caucasus in the way that Turkey is becoming this very close ally to Baku, and that's, you know, fostering this closer economic cooperation, railway cooperation, transport cooperation in between both of each of these countries. And so I think that this is, you know, a trend that we've been seeing for the last couple of years. But like I said, I mean, this is possibly, you know, only a small part of this kind of game, because it's not about linking Nakhchivan to Turkey as it is also, as I've said, linking Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan, because that way you have a railway that bypasses Georgia and all of that kind of, you know, that longer route. So you create a shorter route connecting Azerbaijan to Turkey, which means that you're also looking at a transport corridor that can perhaps link Central Asia to Europe. So, you know, this is why I think that this is the biggest kind of question over here. And of course, for players like Russia to have a working corridor, a transport corridor that can go through other territories other than its own, is a loss, a political loss, a geopolitical loss. And as I mentioned, in the case of Armenia, this is one topic less that they can interfere with or, you know, have a monopoly over if, you know, somebody else has an alternative route. And I think that same thing goes for Iran. They work with Turkey, since Turkey will be, you know, the main interconnector.
So Iran is definitely worried. Russia is positively furious. Georgia is a bit concerned, but they also say, well, perhaps the trade volume will be high enough to actually make up for it, so that both corridors will be in use. But there is another important stakeholder there, and that stakeholder apparently is quite happy about the idea. The stakeholder in question being China, because you have a shorter route leading towards Europe, possibly removing a few days' worth of travel. Now, do you think that this could lead to some interesting dilemmas here? Because we have China having different priorities than, say, Russia, even though the two countries do often see eye to eye on certain issues. On that one, it's probably less likely.
Yeah, I mean, China has its own policy when it comes to connectivity, all those Belt and Road projects that it's been implementing in Central Asia. And so, for China, this is a very good development that this whole Belt and Road going through Central Asia, through the Caucasus, is beginning to take form and shape. Of course, Turkey over here is suddenly becoming perhaps the more important partner for Chinese companies which want to see this route created, which is a huge gain also for Ankara. And of course, a huge loss for Russia, which prior to the war in Ukraine had a monopoly when it came to trade routes going to Europe, because all the railway connections were going through Russia, which was the easiest and the most simple route. The only problem that we have with this new alternative route through Central Asia and the Caucasus is that it passes through a lot of countries. And, it passes also through bottlenecks like the Caspian Sea, like the Bosphorus Strait. So when we talk about railways, we cannot just think of it as one continuous track that goes uninterrupted through, all these barriers, all those borders. So I think that one of the biggest issues that China and Turkey will be possibly tackling over the years, perhaps decades to come, is to simplify customs procedures and simplify, and improve the network transportation as to make it literally viable and economical to use that route to ship certain goods. And I think that this is going to be the main challenge, but also the main direction of cooperation.
But there are major opportunities there. Now, Russia is also not really happy about Turkey seeking energy diversity. There is a contract that was signed, essentially prolonging cooperation with Gazprom, but not for long. And Turkey also is eyeing different sources, including Azerbaijan. So what do you think is going to happen there? Do you think that Turkey will go further down the road of searching for other partners than Russia to get its gas and other energy resources from?
Yes, I mean, we're just preparing a report here at OSW about the changes in the Turkish gas market. And in fact, we see a lot is happening. A lot has happened last year. Turkey has almost doubled its LNG imports from the United States. It has tripled it from third countries, which it has previously not imported from. I'm talking about small countries which don't normally register in Turkish statistics. It's not a huge volume, but it's a seismic shift in terms of the approach. Traditionally, Turkey has relied on Russian gas, which made up between 40 to 50% of its imports. And right now, we're seeing Turkey is trying to diversify its energy suppliers, particularly in terms of gas. It has ended a 25-year-old contract with Russia for gas. However, it has re-extended it, however, this time only for 1 year. So it's a clear sign that Turkey does not want to be bound to Russian gas for long-term contracts. It wants maximum flexibility, in part because it's also diversifying its sources. And through that, this whole agreement with Azerbaijan, that's one part of the bigger calculation that Turkey is playing into, that Ankara wants to have as many diversified sources of energy. It's not about having somebody replace Russia, as it is replacing Russia with, 10, 20 different suppliers, of which Azerbaijan could be, another case. Of course, it does import already gas from Azerbaijan. It's more about making sure that these volumes are are increasing and stable for decades to come. So yes, I mean, again, if we're talking about Turkey-Russia relations, all of that is aimed to also decrease Russia's monopoly and its ability to pressure Turkey to sign contracts which favor Moscow, not Ankara. Right now, Ankara is flipping the table by saying, look, we have so many opportunities on the global market, LNG market with Azerbaijan, we can essentially replace you completely, and you're not going to be able to sell, 20 billion cubic meters of gas. So you better negotiate with us better terms, better volumes, better ways of paying, for these contracts, so that we do not have to pay for gas that we do not buy. And as a result, also, extract as much benefit from Russia. However, it is not about leaving Russia, about not buying Russian gas. It's more about forcing Russia to give better deals to Turkey.
Adam Michalski was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise and insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Germany has pushed back against expectations of Ukraine's possible 2027 accession to the European Union. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said yesterday that Ukraine's approval next year was impossible and out of the question.
Kyiv has long advocated for a fast-track process, arguing that EU membership is critical for post-war recovery and long-term security. Although the European Commission and several member states have praised Ukraine's reform efforts, formal accession talks remain politically sensitive. Hungary has made sure to block key negotiations, pointing to the EU's internal divisions. To bridge these differences, EU officials are reportedly considering phased or tiered accession models that would allow closer integration before full membership is granted.
Russia's second-largest oil producer, Lukoil, is moving to offload its overseas assets as Western sanctions continue to pressure the country's energy sector. Lukoil announced yesterday that it has agreed to sell its foreign holdings to a US-based investment firm, the Carlyle Group.
The sale reflects growing risks faced by companies linked to sanctioned Russian firms. Businesses that continue working with them risk secondary sanctions, which could cut off access to U.S. banks, insurers, transport networks, and commodity traders, key pillars of the global oil market. The Lukoil deal covers most of its international assets, but excludes operations in Kazakhstan and still requires approval from U.S. authorities.
Latvia is preparing contingency plans to rapidly dismantle roads and railways near its eastern border if the security situation with Russia deteriorates. The idea is to deny any invading force the ability to move troops or equipment across Latvian territory using existing transport links.
Ongoing provocations, sabotage, and espionage activity across Europe have prompted Baltic governments to plan for worst-case scenarios. Latvian defense planners view rail connections to Russia and Belarus as a particular vulnerability and argue that they could be exploited in a crisis. Under the proposed approach, transport operators would be equipped to dismantle infrastructure quickly, easing the burden on armed forces. The measures would complement Latvia's expanding border defense, including recently completed fencing and other anti-mobility systems.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.